Hi, this is Jonathan Rosenhead, Jerusalem psychotherapist. This week's Torah and Psychology post of Pasha's Masei is titled Stabilisation. In this week's Pasha, we read about the journeys of Bnei Yisrael as they left Mitzrayim, and there's a record of all the different places that the Bnei Yisrael camped at from leaving Mitzrayim until they came to Eretz Canaan. And it's interesting that the very first place that the Bnei Yisrael came to after they left Mitzrayim was a place called Sukkot. And I'd like to discuss the significance. What is the significance of the first place, the first destination was Sukkot? Because also, if we go back to Parshas Vayishlach, when Yaakov and Esav reconciled and they parted ways, they went in different directions. And Yaakov, when he left Esav's company, he went to Sukkot. So we see here that both when the first destination that Yaakov comes to after leaving Esav is Sukkot, and also the first destination that the Bnei Yisrael come to after leaving Mitzrayim is Sukkot. So what is this place, and what is the significance of this destination at these two particular times, after these two particular events? So if we look at Yaakov and Esav, Yaakov had been living in conflict and was in a fight and flight state of existence in terms of his relationship with Esav. And finally, at this point, they had reconciled, they had made peace, and they were now parting ways. And at this point, Yaakov comes to Sukkot. It's the first time where he can begin to create stability in his life. That he's finally come to he can live in a state of relaxation and start to move on in his life and no longer be living in fear of Esav. And at this point, he starts to settle down. He creates huts. That's why it's called Sukkot. He creates huts. He builds a protection for his animals. And as Rashi explains, he stays there for 18 months. So at this point, finally, we see that Sukkot represents a place for Yaakov to begin to create stability in his life. It's a stage of stabilization before he then moves on, because he can finally leave behind the conflict and the turmoil of his relationship with Esav. And the Bnei Yisrael, when they leave Mitzrayim, they've been living in hardships and difficulty in the slavery in Mitzrayim, and now they move on. They're finally able to move into a state of freedom. And the first place that they come to is Sukkot, because again, Sukkot represents, for the Bnei Yisrael, this destination where they can begin to rebuild their lives. They can begin to create a sense of stability in their life. So this also represents a stage of stabilization for the Bnei Yisrael before they go on to then progress with the rest of their journeys through the Midbar. And by extension, we can also say Chag HaSukkot is the Chag that comes after the Yom HaNorayim, after this intense period of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, where it's in some way it's a difficult time in the year. It's a time of introspection where we go over our actions and our behaviors and things that we want to correct. And finally, we come to Sukkot. We have a time where we can start to relax. It's a time of calm and peace in a sense. And we start to build, there's a sense of stability and stabilization before we move on with the rest of the year and entering into the winter months of the year. So we see this idea, from the word or the place, the destination of Sukkot represents stabilization. So from a therapeutic point of view, I'd like to discuss this idea of stabilization, because in trauma therapy, stabilization is a significant part, an integral part of the therapy that comes, it's a preliminary stage. Before any of the trauma work, before any of the therapeutic work begins, a person needs to establish stabilization in their life. And this involves creating a schedule, a routine, having order and stability, where they're able to self-regulate. And there's a sense of calm in their life, that they're able to function in a normal way. All these factors need to be in place in order to create a stabilization in a person's life and then a person is able to then move on to the next stage in the therapy and actually address the traumatic experience that they have had and actually start to go through the therapeutic process. So this is an integral part. This is an integral preliminary stage in trauma therapy, and it cannot be skipped over. A person needs to establish stabilization in their life and stabilization in themselves before they can move on to therapy, because after all, Sukkot is just a hut. It's a hut that maybe creates some sense of stabilization, but it can be blown over by the winds of trauma, by the traumatic memory. So once stabilization has been created, the person is then able to move on with the actual work of trauma therapy. Have a great Shabbos and keep well.